I am Lexi Allen, 42 years old, a chief warrant officer in technical logistics. 2 months ago, I sold the rights to my military supply software system for $10.5 million. But instead of sharing the good news, I did exactly what my husband suggested. I called my mother and my sister and told them the project had collapsed and I was drowning in debt. The speed at which they turned their backs on me wasn't measured in days, but in hours. That brutal truth proved what my husband had suspected for 15 years. And what happened at my parents' wedding anniversary dinner in front of 40 guests is the reason why I will never pick up the phone to call them ever again. Before we begin, if this story touches you, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you truly feel a connection to it. Leave your location and local time in the comments. I really want to know where you are. Now, let's go back to that Tuesday morning in March. In a lawyer's office thick with the smell of printer toner and black coffee, I signed my name 14 times. Every time I put the pen down, the shrapnel scar in my left shoulder throbbed. The Chicago skyline shrunk in my rearview mirror. I pushed my SUV toward the outskirts, leaving the steel and glass of the city for the rusting bones of Millfield. My hand gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned the color of bone. In the back seat sat a folder containing a receipt for $10.5 million. To the world, I was a success. To the people waiting for me at the end of this drive, I was just a paycheck with a pulse. 20 years ago, this same road felt like an escape hatch. I could still see my sister, Jocelyn, standing on the porch back then, clutching a manila envelope. My parents had handed her the entire family nest egg, $180,000, to fund a prestige degree she never used and a summer backpacking through the elite streets of Europe. I was 18. My father didn't give me a check. He didn't even give me a hug. He handed me a one-way bus ticket to basic training and a coarse, olive-drab canvas rucksack. "The army will feed you," was all he said. I pulled into the driveway of my house in Millfield. The gravel crunched under my tires, a dry, gritty sound that matched the mood in my chest. I stepped into the kitchen, the scent of sawdust and heavy-duty degreaser clinging to the air. Marcus was already there, hunched over the granite island. His work jacket was tossed over a stool, the fabric stained with the gray dust of a construction site. He didn't ask about the $10 million deal. He didn't ask how it felt to finally be rich. Marcus was a former Marine. He dealt in logistics and survival, not celebration. He just slid a yellow legal pad across the cold stone counter. At the very top, circled in aggressive red ink, was a number that felt like a punch to the gut. $347,000. "That's the tally, Lex," he said, his voice as flat as a casualty report. He tapped the paper with a dull pencil, the rhythmic click-clack echoing off the backsplash. I looked down at the lines. Every entry was a record of a lie. 2012, Marcus read aloud. "You sent $15,000 back home because your mother said the roof was caving in. You were eating MREs in a hole in the dirt during a deployment to save that cash." That same month, Patty was posting photos from a luxury cruise in the Caribbean. The roof is still leaking, by the way. He flipped the page. The pencil lead scratched against the yellow paper. $8,000 last year for Brianna's private school tuition, Marcus continued. "Jocelyn told you the kid was going to be kicked out. A week after the wire transfer hit her account, she showed up at church with a brand new designer handbag that cost more than my first truck." I felt the old military ATM syndrome tightening around my throat. It was a familiar chokehold. I had spent 2 decades trading my safety for their vanity. Every cent of my hazard pay, money earned while people were actively trying to kill me, had been ground down in the gears of the Allen family's entitlement. Marcus leaned back, his eyes locking onto mine with the intensity of a spotter. He remembered the things I tried to forget. "Remember 2015? He asked, his voice dropping an octave. I didn't need to be reminded. I could still feel the phantom heat of the mortar fragment tearing into my shoulder blade. I had spent 2 months in a military hospital, staring at a sterile white ceiling, waiting for the door to open. Marcus was the only one who ever walked through it. The visitor log for my mother, my father, and my sister was a solid block of empty white space. Not a single phone call, not a single card. "They don't love you, Lexi," Marcus said, pushing the legal pad even closer. "They love the access you provide. If you want to know the truth, we need a tactical shift." I looked at my hands. They were calloused, scarred, and steady. The life I had built was made of grit and discipline. The life they lived was a facade built on my back. "What's the play?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning, you call them," Marcus said. "Tell them the software project failed. Tell them the government pulled the contract and you're on the hook for every dime. Tell them you're bankrupt and you need a place to stay because the bank is taking the house." He paused, letting the silence of the kitchen settle around us like dust. "If they see you as family, they'll prove me wrong," he said. "They'll offer you a couch, they'll offer you a meal. But if they see you as a broken machine, they'll scrap you." I stared at the $347,000 figure on the paper. It was a massive price tag for a lie I had been telling myself for 40 years. I wasn't a daughter or a sister, I was a commodity. The weight of the $10 million in my SUV felt like lead. It was enough to buy 1,000 roofs and 10,000 handbags, but it couldn't buy the one thing I actually wanted. I looked at Marcus and gave a single, sharp nod. "Fine," I said, my voice cold and final. "We run the test." I reached for my phone, but Marcus shook his head. "Not tonight," he said. "Sleep on it. Tomorrow morning, at first light, we see who they really are." I walked to the window and looked out at the dark Pennsylvania woods. Somewhere out there, my mother was probably sleeping in a bed I had paid for, under a roof she claimed was broken. The test would begin at 6 o'clock. And deep down, I already knew the casualty count was going to be high. The morning light didn't break through the curtains so much as it bruised them, a dull, sickly gray hanging over the bedroom. It was 6 o'clock sharp. My internal clock, forged by years of drills and early morning rucks, didn't need an alarm. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning under my weight, a stiff, hollow sound that echoed the emptiness in my gut. My left shoulder was a knot of cold fire, the shrapnel scar acting as a weather vane for the damp Pennsylvania morning. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my face, highlighting the lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before my last tour. It was time. I had a script to run, a lie to tell. Marcus and I had agreed on the tactical approach. I was bankrupt, I was broken, and I was coming home to roost. I opened my contacts to find my mother. I typed Patty into the search bar, my thumb hovering over her name. But then, the algorithm did something it wasn't supposed to do. It pulled up a deep link archive, a cache of data buried under months of newer notifications. At the bottom of the list, a group chat name appeared that made the air vanish from my lungs. Allen family. I stared at it. The icon was a photo from 2 summers ago. My parents, Jocelyn, and her husband Todd, all grinning over a barbecue spread at a lake house I had rented for them. I wasn't in the photo. And as I tapped the thread, I realized I wasn't in the group anymore either. I had been removed 8 months ago, right around the time I mentioned the Meridian software was entering the final testing phase. I scrolled up, my finger trembling just enough to make the screen stutter. This wasn't just a family chat about Sunday dinners or Brianna's soccer practice. This was a war room. And I was the territory being occupied. "Make sure you sound tired when you call her," Jocelyn had messaged back in November. "She's always a sucker for the weary soldier act. Mention the roof again. If she thinks we're struggling, she won't check the receipts." My mother's reply came seconds later, decorated with heart emojis that felt like drops of poison. "I know, honey. I'll tell her the leak is getting into the insulation next week. That usually gets her to wire at least $5,000. Don't worry about the cruise deposit. We'll have the cash by Friday." I felt a coldness spread from my chest to my fingertips, a physiological shutdown I recognized from the field. It was the sound of a perimeter being breached. Every tear my mother had shed over the phone for the last decade, every, "I don't know how we'll get by," from Jocelyn. It was all scripted. It was a standard operating procedure. They had tracked my deployment cycles like a harvest season. They knew when the hazard pay hit. They knew when the bonuses were processed. I wasn't a daughter to them. I wasn't a sister who had bled in a foreign desert so they could sleep in silk sheets. I was a military ATM, a resource to be managed and depleted. They used my niece, Brianna, as bait, dangling her tuition like a ransom note to ensure the checks kept coming. I didn't cry. The betrayal was too dense for tears, a heavy leaden weight that sat behind my ribs. Instead, the training took over. My back straightened, my chin tucked, and I focused on the wall. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The sniper's breath. I sucked the air in, feeling it cold against my teeth, and forced the rising panic into a small steel box in the back of my mind. I realized then that the last 15 years of my life had been a tactical error. I had been defending a position that had already been sold out from the inside. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been the person who carries the whole family on your back, only to realize they see you as a paycheck instead of a person? If you've ever felt that cold realization that the people who should love you most are actually the ones using you, hit that like button right now. It helps me know I'm not alone in this. And do me a favor, comment the word ATM down below if you've ever been treated like one. I want to see how many of us are out there. Don't forget to subscribe. The next part of this mission is where the real fire starts. The bathroom door creaked open. Marcus stepped out, a towel draped over his scarred shoulder, the scent of pine soap cutting through the stale air of the room. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, sitting there in the blue light, my face a mask of granite, and he knew. I didn't look up. I just held the phone out so he could see the screen. I watched his jaw set, his eyes scanning the messages with the practiced ease of a man looking for claymores in the tall grass. He didn't offer pity. He knew I didn't want it. "I'm saving these," I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. I hit the share icon and uploaded every screenshot to my secure cloud drive. One copy for the records, one copy for the war to come. I felt the shift then. The daughter who wanted her mother's approval was dead. The sister who wanted to protect her family was gone. All that was left was the chief warrant officer. I stood up, my movements precise and lethal. I didn't need a script anymore. I had the truth, and the truth was a weapon I was finally ready to fire. I scrolled back to Patty's contact info. Marcus put a heavy hand on my shoulder, a solid anchor in the storm. I took one last, deep breath. In for 4, hold for 4, and pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. My heart was a steady, rhythmic thud in my chest, a drumbeat for a march they didn't know was coming. "Lexi," my mother's voice chirped, already layering on that thin, calculated sweetness. "Everything okay, honey? I was just thinking about that roof." I closed my eyes, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. "Mom," I said, my voice cracking perfectly, just like Jocelyn told her it would. "I've got a problem, a big one." The trap was set. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a long, lonely frequency that felt like a tripwire stretching across the kitchen. Marcus didn't move. He just leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on me, arms crossed over his chest. He was the spotter. I was the shooter. We were about to see if the targets would hold their ground or run. Patty picked up on the third ring. I could hear the rattling of a spoon against a ceramic mug. Probably the expensive set I'd bought her last Christmas. I took a jagged breath, forcing my vocal cords to tighten, mimicking the tremor of a woman on the edge of a breakdown. "Mom," I said. My voice was thin, fragile. "The Meridian Project. It's gone. A major bug in the supply software. They canceled the contract this morning. They're coming after me for the bridge loans. I'm deep in the red, Mom. I'm looking at total bankruptcy." I waited for the, "Are you okay?" I waited for the, "Come home, we'll figure it out." I would have even settled for a, "Don't worry, honey." Instead, there was a 3-second void. 3 seconds where the only sound was the static on the line and the heavy grunt-like exhale of a woman who had just realized her golden goose was cooked. "What do you mean?" Patty's voice wasn't soft. It was dry, like old parchment. "Meridian is a huge company. How could you let that happen?" "I don't know, Mom. I'm just—" "Lexi, listen to me," she cut in, her tone sharpening into a blade. "What about the money I asked for? The $3,000 for the property taxes and the gardener? I need that by the 1st of the month. You promised." "I don't have it, Mom. I don't even have rent for next month." "Unbelievable," she spat. There was no pity. No concern for whether I had a roof over my head or food in my fridge. Just the cold, hard entitlement of a woman who saw her child as a failing investment. "I have people coming over for bridge tomorrow. I can't be worried about your poor business choices. Figure it out." Click. The dial tone returned, sharper this time. A long, screeching beep that felt like it was drilling into my skull. I lowered the phone. My hand was steady, but my chest felt like it had been scooped out with a jagged spoon. "Next one," Marcus said. His voice was a low growl. He knew. He'd always known. I dialed Jocelyn. This one was shorter. It didn't even hit the 20-second mark. "Jocelyn, I'm in trouble. I've lost the project. I'm bankrupt." "You have got to be kidding me," Jocelyn shrieked, her voice hitting a register that made me wince. "Lexi, Brianna's private school tuition is due in 3 weeks. We already signed the papers because you said you had it. How can you be this selfish?" "Selfish?" I repeated, the word tasting like copper in my mouth. "Yes. You're always so obsessed with your career and your software. And now you've screwed up my kid's future. Don't call me back until you have a solution. I can't deal with your drama right now." Bip, bip, bip. She hung up so fast I wondered if she'd been waiting for the excuse. I sat there, staring at the blank screen. I wasn't bankrupt. I had $10.5 million sitting in a secure account. But in this kitchen, in this moment, I was more penniless than I had ever been in my life. 10 minutes passed. Then, the phone on the island started to vibrate. It didn't stop. The family chat, the other one, the one I was still allowed to see, was lighting up like a Christmas tree in a lightning storm. Patty was the first to fire. "Lexi is bankrupt," she typed. The letters were all caps, a digital scream. I knew letting her handle that kind of money was a mistake. Everyone listen. Do not lend her a dime. She's a bottomless pit now. She brought this on herself with her arrogance. Jocelyn jumped in before the bubbles could even disappear. "Typical Lexi, spending years acting like she's better than us because she's a soldier. Now she's just another failure. We can't let her drag the family down with her. She's on her own." I looked down at the bottom of the screen. A tiny gray line of text appeared, read by Don Allen. My father. He was sitting in his recliner 3 miles away, the blue light of the TV probably reflecting off his glasses. He was watching his wife and his eldest daughter tear his youngest child to pieces in a public forum. He saw every word. He saw the no loans order. He saw the failure tag. He didn't type a single letter. He didn't send a private text saying, "Are you okay, kid?" He just stayed in his hole, hiding behind his cowardice, choosing the quiet life over his own blood. His silence was the deepest cut of all, a jagged blade of indifference that severed the last thread of my loyalty. I reached out and picked up my mug. The coffee was stone cold and blacker than coal. I drank it all in one go. It was bitter, stinging my throat, but it was the most honest thing I'd felt all morning. Marcus stood up and walked over to the island. He didn't offer a hug. He just took the empty mug from my hand and set it down. "Intelligence gathering is complete," I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was the voice of a CWO who had just identified every hostile actor in the theater of operations. What's the status of the targets? Marcus asked. I locked my phone screen, the light fading into a black void. I looked at him, my eyes hard and clear as flint. Targets identified, I replied. The mission is no longer a test. It's an extraction. And from this moment on, they're dead to me. I stood up and smoothed out my shirt, my movements precise. The family Allen thought they had just cut loose a burden. They had no idea they had just started a war with the only person who was keeping them afloat. The real battle was just beginning. The silence in the kitchen wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy ionized air before a lightning strike. I set my phone face down on the granite island, the glass clicking against the stone like a firing pin hitting an empty chamber. Marcus didn't move. He just watched me, his eyes two dark pits of shared history. Then the landline rang. A shrill mechanical intrusion that made the hair on my arms stand up. I picked up. I didn't say hello. I waited. Lexi, Patty's voice came through, sharp and clinical. No, how are you? No, I'm sorry you lost everything. Just the cold tone of a manager dealing with a defective piece of equipment. About next week, the 40th anniversary dinner at Rosewood Grill. I've been thinking. I looked at the scars on my knuckles. And? People talk, Lexi. Millfield is a small town, and news of your situation is already circulating. It's better if you stay home. Rest. Get your head straight. We don't need you there looking like a ghost and making everyone uncomfortable with talk of debt. Don't embarrass the family. She didn't want me there because I was her daughter. She wanted me erased because I was now a stain on the carefully polished Allen family portrait. A liability. I will be there, Mother, I said. My voice was a flatline. Don't be difficult, Lexi. This is my night. Don't ruin. I hung up. I didn't press the button. I slammed the receiver into the cradle. The plastic cracked. A small, jagged fissure. It felt honest. 20 minutes later, the piece was shattered again. Not by a ring, but by a rhythmic, violent thudding against the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a demand. I didn't have to check the ring camera. I knew the cadence. I opened the door just as Jocelyn's fist was coming down again. She didn't wait for an invite. She shouldered past me, the clatter of her high heels on my oak floors sounding like a hammer drill. She brought the stench of cheap floral perfume with her, a suffocating cloud that turned my stomach. She stopped in the center of the living room, her eyes darting around, appraising my furniture, my TV, the original crown molding I'd paid to restore. She looked like a vulture measuring a carcass. I'm here to help you pack, Jocelyn snapped. She didn't look at me. She was looking at my fireplace mantle. You need to list this place by Friday. Marcus can move his tools into a storage unit. You're bankrupt, Lexi. You can't afford the taxes, let alone the mortgage. I leaned against the doorframe, my arms crossed. Pack. Don't be dense, she huffed, finally turning to face me. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with a frantic sort of greed. I've already talked to Mom. We'll sell the house. We'll split the equity 50-50. I need Brianna's tuition covered, and since you're just a soldier, you don't need all this space anyway. You're used to barracks and tents, right? You'll be fine in a studio apartment. The air in the room thickened. This was the middle-class narcissism Patty had cultivated in her. The absolute belief that my blood and sweat were communal property because I lacked a degree from an Ivy League school. I had spent 15 months in a Humvee in 120-degree heat to pay for this roof. I had carried a 60-pound pack until my knees felt like they were filled with broken glass so Jocelyn could have a backup fund. I didn't scream. I didn't explain. I just watched her. I watched the way her hands twitched as she mentally spent the money from my front yard. Marcus stepped out of the hallway. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, 6'2" of scarred muscle and quiet menace. He shifted his weight, his boots creaking slightly. He looked like a man deciding where to bury a problem. Jocelyn's rant faltered. She looked at Marcus, then back at me. The silence from us was a physical weight. a crushing pressure that began to suck the oxygen out of her bravado. She started to stutter. I'm just being realistic, Lexi. You're drowning. I'm trying to save you from... The keys are in my pocket, I said. My voice was low, vibrating in my chest. The name on the deed is mine, not yours, not Mom's. I stepped forward, closing the gap until I was inches from her. I could see the sweat beads breaking through her heavy foundation. You have exactly 10 seconds to get your feet off my floor and your shadow out of my house, I whispered. Each word was a jagged stone. 9, 8. You can't talk to me like... 7. Marcus is holding his phone, Jocelyn. 6. He's one tap away from calling the county sheriff. I'll have you trespassed before you hit the end of the driveway. 5. She looked at Marcus. He held up his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. His face was a mask of cold indifference. He wasn't her brother-in-law right now. He was a threat. Fine, Jocelyn shrieked, her voice cracking. Be selfish. Rot in your empty house. Just wait until Mom hears about this. She turned and fled, her heels skidding on the wood. She nearly tripped over the threshold. I stood on the porch and watched her scramble into her SUV. She floored it, the tires screaming against the asphalt, leaving 2 black streaks of rubber on the road. I stepped back inside and closed the heavy oak door. I turned the deadbolt. Thunk. I flipped the security latch. Click. The house went into lockdown. The perimeter was set. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door. My heart was thudding a slow, steady rhythm. The rage was gone, replaced by a crystalline, freezing resolve. They weren't just parasites anymore. They were invaders. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a bunker. Suddenly, the landline rang again. I stared at it. I wasn't going to answer. But then Marcus walked over and looked at the caller ID. It's not Patty, he said. It's Loretta Briggs. I frowned, reaching for the phone. Loretta. The old history teacher from down the street, the woman who saw everything and forgot nothing. I picked up the receiver. Loretta? Lexi, honey. The old woman's voice crackled, sharp as a winter frost. You might want to check the Millfield community page. Your mother is currently holding court at the church hall, and she's telling everyone you've lost your mind. The artillery is incoming, girl. You ready? I gripped the phone, a grim smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Artillery received, Loretta, I said. Prepare for counter-battery fire. Friday morning in Millfield felt like a wet wool blanket. A thick, gray Pennsylvania fog clung to the window panes, blurring the lines of the skeletal oak trees in my backyard. I stood at the counter, my back straight, my eyes tracking the condensation as it dripped down the glass. The house was quiet, but the town wasn't. In a place this small, secrets don't just leak, they flood. Patty had spent her morning at the Grace Community Church Hall. She didn't go for the gospel. She went for the audience. By 9 o'clock, the prayer warriors were already buzzing. I could almost see her there, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief I'd bought her in D.C. She'd be leaning in close to the other deacons' wives, her voice a practiced, tragic whisper. She just lost it all, Patty would be saying, her face a mask of manufactured grief. The pride, the arrogance, the army changed her. She's bankrupt, mortgaging her soul just to keep that big house. We're praying for her, but honestly, it's a tragedy of her own making. I'm just a mother trying to pick up the pieces while she drags us down. She was running a classic smear campaign. It wasn't just about the money anymore. She was stripping away my rank, my service, and my sanity. All to make sure that when the town looked at me, they didn't see a decorated officer. They saw a failure, a disgrace, a ghost in a green suit. The doorbell rang at 10:30. It wasn't the frantic, entitled pounding of Jocelyn. It was 2 steady, deliberate chimes. I didn't reach for my holster, but my hand shifted toward the kitchen knife block out of habit. I checked the peephole. Loretta Briggs was standing on my porch, She was 75 years old, her back as stiff as a cedar post, wrapped in a heavy wool coat that smelled like mothballs and wood smoke. In her hands, she held a circular object wrapped tightly in crinkled tinfoil. I opened the door. Loretta didn't wait for an invite. She marched into the kitchen, her sensible rubber boots squeaking on the hardwood. She set the package on the granite island with a firm thud. "Your mother is running her mouth like a late-night talk show host," Loretta said. She didn't bother with a greeting. She pulled out a stool and sat down, her sharp blue eyes scanning my face for cracks. "She's got the whole church convinced you're one step away from a padded cell. She's telling everyone you're washed up." I didn't blink. I walked to the cupboard. "Coffee, Loretta?" "Black, no sugar. I'm too old for the sweet stuff," she snapped. She watched me as I moved, my motions precise, my posture unchanged. I poured the coffee, the steam rising in a bitter cloud. I set the mug in front of her. Loretta reached out and gripped it with hands that were gnarled like tree roots. "Let them talk," I said. My voice was a low, steady hum. Loretta looked at the tinfoil package. "I brought you a cherry pie, still warm. I used the sour ones from the orchard." She paused, her gaze softening just a fraction. 10 years ago, Lexi, I fell and broke my hip on that icy sidewalk. My own nephew wouldn't answer the phone. You were in E4 back then, making pennies, stationed halfway across the country. You sent me a check for $800 to fix my fence so the dog wouldn't get out. You didn't tell a soul. Not even Marcus. I remembered that check. It had meant 3 months of skipping beers and eating cheap canned tuna in the barracks. "The Allens didn't even bring me a casserole," Loretta continued, her voice turning flinty. "I've watched you since you were a skinny kid in pigtails, Lexi. I know who carries the weight in this town, and who just sits on the wagon. Patty thinks she's winning because she's got the loudest megaphone. She forgets that I've taught history for 40 years. I know how empires fall." I took a bite of the pie. It was sharp, tart, and burned the roof of my mouth. It was the only thing in Millfield that didn't taste like a lie. "No one can set up a defensive perimeter for you, girl," Loretta said, standing up. She adjusted her coat, her eyes locking onto mine with a ferocity that made her look 40 years younger. "You've spent your whole life being the supply line for people who would starve you to death. It's time you stopped being the ATM and started being the officer. You have to shoot your own last shot." She didn't ask for a thank you. She walked herself to the door, leaving the scent of tart cherries and cold air behind. I watched her old Buick sedan pull away, her brake lights glowing red through the mist. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, the silence pressing in. Loretta's words were a tactical assessment. She was right. The town thought I was a casualty. Patty thought I was a ghost. Then my ringer went off. I looked at the screen. It was Jocelyn. I waited until the 5th ring to answer. "Lexi." Her voice was different. The screeching, entitled harridan from 2 days ago was gone. Now it was dripping with a sugary, calculated warmth that made my skin crawl. "Honey, listen. Mom and I have been talking. We've been praying on it. We realized we were just stressed. We're family, right? And family sticks together when things get tough." I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. "Mom really wants you at the anniversary dinner tomorrow night," Jocelyn continued, her voice purring like a cat near a bowl of cream. "We've even saved you a seat at the head table. We want to show the town that the Allens are united. You're coming, aren't you?" I looked at the cherry pie on the counter. The red filling looked like a fresh wound. "I'll be there, Jocelyn," I said. My voice was a dead, flat calm. "Tell Mom I wouldn't miss it for the world." I hung up and stared at the dark phone screen. They didn't know I'd found the emails. They didn't know I knew they'd been planning this for 6 months. They thought I was walking into a trap. They were wrong. I was walking into a target-rich environment. The real war starts at dinner. Jocelyn Allen didn't do sweet without a payday. Her voice on the phone had been a warning siren in my head, a red flag flapping in a gale. Marcus felt it too. He stood in the kitchen, a silhouette against the rising sun, his shadow long and jagged on the hardwood floor. He watched me put the phone down and let out a dry, humorless grunt. "They're fishing for something bigger than a check this time, Lexi," he said, his voice like grinding gravel. It was Saturday morning. The anniversary dinner at Rosewood Grill was exactly 12 hours away. I didn't go back to bed. Instead, I went to the small office in the back of the house, the one that smelled like old paper and copper. I sat in front of the computer, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, turning them into cold, glass marbles. For 15 years, I'd been the logistical backbone of the Army. I knew how to find a needle in a haystack of data, especially when that needle was a lie. I started digging. I didn't look at recent messages. I went deep, back into the digital sediment of the last year. I rucked through old tax notifications, county property records, and every email thread involving my father, Don Allen. 2 hours passed in a blur of scrolling and clicking. The mechanical keyboard under my fingers sounded like a slow-motion machine gun. Clack, clack, clack. My back was a straight line, my breathing shallow and controlled. Then, I found it. Buried at the bottom of a deleted folder from 6 months ago, like a landmine waiting for a footstep. It was a forwarded email. The sender was a guy named Jerry, a low-level accountant at the county tax office and a regular at the local dive bar where my father drank his weight in cheap lager every Friday. The subject line was blank. The content was a gut punch. It was a preliminary inquiry notice. The Meridian Group had been doing their due diligence. They had sent a routine check to the county office to verify the tax standing of a specific intellectual property asset held by one Lexi Allen. Jerry had seen the name. He had seen the numbers, a buyout offer for $10.5 million, and he'd sent it straight to his drinking buddy, Don. The timestamp was October, 6 months ago. My blood didn't boil, it turned to slush. I followed the trail. Don hadn't replied to Jerry. Instead, he'd forwarded that email to Patty. The curtain was ripped back, and the buck-naked truth was staring me in the face. They knew. For half a year, my family had played a coordinated game of theater. Every leaking roof was a fiction. Every emergency tuition payment was a tactical raid on my bank account. They knew I was about to become a millionaire, and they decided to bleed me for every cent of my hazard pay before the big money hit. They wanted to drain the well dry before the storm arrived. I saw it all clearly now. The military ATM wasn't a nickname. It was their strategic objective. They'd sat in church, prayed for my safety, and then went home to calculate how much of my blood they could convert into a designer handbag or a Caribbean cruise. I stared at the screen until the words blurred into a gray haze. My knuckles were white, the skin stretched so tight over the bone it looked like it would split. I wasn't just a daughter to them, I was a target-rich environment. I hit the print button. The machine whirred to life, a slow mechanical groan that filled the small room. The paper slid out, still warm from the toner. I picked it up, the heat of it seeping into my fingertips. It was the most brutal evidence of betrayal I'd ever held. I didn't shake. I didn't scream. I just folded the paper into a tight, military square, a perfect four-way fold. I slid it into the inner pocket of my jacket, right next to the official receipt for the $10.5 million wire transfer. 2 pieces of paper, one for my future and one for their destruction. Have you ever caught someone you love in a lie so big it felt like the floor disappeared? If you've been the one holding the receipts while they're still lying to your face, hit that like button right now. It's the only way to keep the truth loud. Comment the word bingo down below if you've ever had that moment where all the pieces finally fit and the truth was uglier than you imagined. Subscribe to make sure you're in the front row for what happens at Rosewood Grill. Marcus was leaning against the doorframe when I walked out of the office. He didn't ask what I'd found. He saw the look in my eyes, the cold, dead-eyed stare of a soldier who had just received the order to fire. He tossed me the car keys. The metal jingled in the quiet hallway. I caught them mid-air. "Time's up," he said, his voice flat. I gave him a single, sharp nod. I wasn't going to a family anniversary. I was going to a burial. Tonight, at Rosewood Grill, there wouldn't be any cake. There would only be the fallout. I stepped out into the Pennsylvania air, the cold wind hitting my face. I didn't feel the chill. I only felt the weight of the papers in my pocket. The mission was live. I put the truck in gear and headed toward the center of Millfield. I could see the lights of Rosewood Grill in the distance, glowing like embers in a dying fire. The Allens were waiting for their payday. They were about to get a lesson in combat logistics instead. The heavy iron door of the Rosewood Grill swung shut with a dull, final thud. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of overpriced steak, industrial floor wax, and the suffocating floral perfume of 40 guests. Yellow light from the faux crystal chandeliers hatted the room, casting long, sickly shadows across the white tablecloths. Every head turned as Marcus and I walked in. I felt the weight of the whispers before I heard them. A sea of eyes, pitying, judgmental, and hungry for the latest tragedy, locked onto us. I stood straight, my shoulders square, my posture a rigid line of military discipline. Marcus walked a half-step behind me, his heavy boots muffled by the thin red carpet. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the exits. Patty Allen emerged from the cluster of church ladies like a predator in red silk. Her dress was the color of a fresh wound. She glided toward me, her face a masterpiece of practiced concern. When she reached us, she didn't just hug me. She staged an act of maternal charity for the onlookers. Her arms were stiff, her skin cold. She leaned in, her breath smelling of cheap champagne and peppermint. "Just stay quiet and look grateful," she hissed into my ear, her voice a sharp needle under the velvet. Then, pulling back, she spoke for the room to hear. "Oh, Lexi, honey, I'm so glad you could make it despite everything. Just sit, rest, we've got you." Dinner was a slow-motion execution. Patty took the microphone early, her glass of bubbly raised high. She spent 10 minutes detailing Jocelyn's academic brilliance and her prestige career in marketing. She called Jocelyn the golden heart of the family, the one who carried the Allen name with dignity and a master's degree. Then her eyes flickered to me, a brief, sharp twitch of the lip. "And then there is Lexi," Patty sighed, the sound amplified by the speakers. "Our little soldier. Life hasn't been kind to her lately. The army. Well, it's a hard life for a woman, and not everyone is cut out for the transition back to the real world. She's hit some rough water, folks, but we're family. We take care of our own, even the ones who stumble." The pity in the room was a physical pressure, a hot, greasy wave. I didn't touch my wine. I watched the bubbles die in the glass. Across the room, Loretta Briggs caught my eye. She set her glass down with a sharp clink against the wood, her face a mask of granite. She was the only one not clapping. Jocelyn took the stage next. She looked like a catalog model for mid-level greed. She announced the purchase of the Maple Ridge Mansion, a 5-bedroom estate that cost more than a small town in Pennsylvania. She beamed, her teeth white and predatory. "We're moving up," Jocelyn chirped, her gaze sweeping over the guests until it landed on me. She didn't offer a smile. She offered a death blow. "And Lexi, I've been thinking about you and Marcus. Since the bank is going to be taking your place soon, I've talked to Todd. We're keeping our current house as a rental. We'll give you a family discount. It's small, but hey, it's a roof, right? You're used to sleeping in the dirt anyway. We won't let you hit the streets." A few people chuckled. A few more looked at their plates, embarrassed. Jocelyn didn't care. She had just publicly branded me a failure in front of everyone who mattered in Millfield. She used my 20 years of service as a punchline to highlight her own climb up the social ladder. I looked at Marcus. His jaw was set so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. He didn't move. Neither did I. I just reached into my jacket pocket and felt the crisp edges of the two papers waiting there. When the speeches ended and the servers began clearing the plates, Todd, my brother-in-law, a man who smelled of sweat and desperation, slid into the chair next to me. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at my hands. He pulled a thick manila folder from his blazer. He didn't say a word as he opened it, revealing a set of documents stamped with the logo of a major national bank. He pushed them toward me, followed by a heavy gold pen. "What's this, Todd?" I asked. My voice was a low, dangerous hum. "It's a formality, Lex," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the head table where Jocelyn was laughing with a deacon. "The Maple Ridge place. It's a big jump. The bank needs more collateral. They're using Mom and Dad's house as the primary, but the debt-to-income ratio is still off. They want a third-party co-signer." I looked at the document. Co-signer agreement and security instrument. You want me to sign for a house I'll never step foot in? "Look, you're already bankrupt," Todd said, his voice turning oily and persuasive. "Your credit is shot anyway. This doesn't hurt you. But your signature, listing you as an additional obligated party, gets the deal over the finish line. Mom and Dad already signed. See?" He flipped to the last page. There they were, Dawn and Patty's signatures, shaky but real. They had put their own home on the line to buy Jocelyn a mansion, and now they were using me as the legal sacrificial lamb. They didn't want my help. They wanted my liability. They invited me here to humiliate me into a corner where I couldn't say no. They thought a woman with nothing left would sign anything to stay in the family's good graces. I picked up the pen. It was heavy. Cold. "Lexi, just do it," Patty's voice came from behind me. She had appeared like a ghost. Her hand settled on my shoulder, her fingers digging in like claws. "It's the least you can do after all the stress you've caused us this week. Help your sister. Be a part of the family for once." I looked at the paper. Then I looked up at Jocelyn, who was watching me from across the table, a smug, expectant look on her face. She thought she'd won. She thought the military ATM was about to dispense one last massive payout. I didn't sign. I held the pen over the line, my hand steady as a rock. "You really want my name on this, Jocelyn?" I asked, my voice carrying across the quieted table. "Just sign it, Lexi," Jocelyn snapped, her patience finally thinning. "Stop making a scene." I felt the fuse burn down to the powder. The room went silent. The yellow light seemed to flare. "I'm not signing a damn thing," I said. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor like a scream. I looked at the contract, then back at the woman who called herself my mother. "But I do have something for you." I reached into my pocket, not for the pen, for the fire. The bomb was ready to drop. I let the gold pen fall. It didn't roll. It hit the white linen tablecloth with a heavy, dead thud and stayed there, pointing at Todd like a finger accusing a thief. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and perfectly vertical. I wasn't just getting out of a chair, I was taking the high ground. The chair legs screeched against the hardwood floor, a sharp, jagged sound that sliced through the low hum of the rosewood grill like a razor blade. The room went vacuum-sealed. 40 guests, the pillars of Millfield society, froze with their forks halfway to their mouths. I could see the reflection of the faux crystal chandeliers in the wine glasses, but all I focused on was the woman in the red silk dress. "I'm not signing a damn thing," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the dry, echoing resonance of a commanding officer delivering a summary judgment. I pushed the manila folder back toward Todd. He flinched as if the paper were hot. "Lexi, sit down," Patty hissed. She reached out, her fingers like iron talons, trying to snag my sleeve. Her face was a mask of panicked composure, her eyes darting toward the deacon's wives at the next table. "Stop this nonsense. You're making a scene. Just sign the papers and let's get through the dessert." "Sign it!" Jocelyn's voice erupted from the head of the table. She didn't whisper. She didn't care about the guests anymore. Her face was the color of raw beef, her carefully curled hair starting to fray at the edges. She slammed her palm onto the table, making the champagne flutes dance. "You're broke, Lexi. You're a failed soldier with a ruined credit score and a house you can't afford. You're only useful to this family when you're writing checks, and since you can't even do that anymore, the least you can do is sign for my house. Without your name on that line, you're just trash we have to tolerate." The silence that followed was heavy, oily, and suffocating. Jocelyn stood there, breathing hard, her chest heaving under her designer blouse. She had just said the quiet part out loud. She had just confirmed that 20 years of my blood, sweat, and shrapnel were worth exactly zero unless they were converted into her equity. From the back corner of the room, a chair moved. Loretta Briggs stood up. She didn't look at me. She looked straight at Jocelyn. "Listen to yourself, girl," Loretta said, her voice cutting through the tension like a winter frost. "You just told this entire room that your sister's only value is the balance in her bank account. Is that what we're here to celebrate? 20 years of service traded for a mansion in Maple Ridge?" Jocelyn opened her mouth to snap back, but I didn't give her the chance. I reached into my inner jacket pocket. My hand was steady, my pulse a rhythmic, slow throb. I pulled out the first piece of paper, the official bank receipt. I didn't hand it over. I slapped it down onto the glass centerpiece of the table. Whack! "I'm not bankrupt, Jocelyn," I said. I leaned forward, my shadow falling over her plate of untouched steak. "The Meridian deal went through 4 days ago. $10.5 million. Cash. It's sitting in a high-yield account with my name, and only my name, on the title." The air left the room. Patty's jaw didn't just drop, it hung slack. Don, who had been trying to blend into his chair, dropped his silver fork. It hit the porcelain plate with a sharp, high-pitched ping that sounded like a gunshot. Jocelyn's eyes went wide, her pupils shrinking into tiny black pinpricks of greed and shock. "But wait," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I've got something else for the record." I pulled out the second paper, the folded, military square. I unfolded it slowly, the crinkle of the paper the only sound in the restaurant. "I found the email, Dad," I said, looking directly at the man who had stayed silent for 6 months. "I found the message Jerry sent you from the tax office back in October. The one where he told you Meridian was sniffing around my software. The one you forwarded to Mom." I turned the paper around so the whole table could see the timestamps. "You all knew," I said, and for the first time, a sliver of ice-cold fury bled into my tone. "You knew the millions were coming, and instead of being happy for me, you decided to run a 6-month tactical raid on my bank account. You faked the leaking roof, Patty. You faked the tuition crisis, Jocelyn. You wanted to bleed every nickel of my hazard pay out of me before I realized I didn't need you anymore." I looked at the guests. "My mother spent the morning at church telling you all I was a failure. She did that so she could guilt me into signing a contract that would have made me responsible for Jocelyn's debt. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a sacrificial lamb." I reached over and took the gold pen from Todd's frozen hand. I didn't sign the contract. I clicked the pen shut and dropped it into Jocelyn's wine glass. It sank to the bottom with a dull splash. "The ATM is closed," I said. I turned to Marcus. He was already standing, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. I buttoned my vest. 1, 2. The fabric was crisp. I felt light. I felt like I had finally cut the pack off my back after a 20-mile ruck. "From this moment on, there is a total ceasefire on all funding," I announced to the table. "No more roofs, no more tuition, no more designer bags. You wanted to treat me like a commodity? Fine, but you just lost the contract." I turned my back on them. I didn't look at Patty's fake tears or Jocelyn's screeching protests. I walked toward the exit, my back straight, my chin up. The sound of my heels on the tile floor was a steady, rhythmic cadence. Clack, clack, clack. It was the sound of a period at the end of a long, ugly sentence. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of Rosewood Grill and stepped out into the cold, clean Pennsylvania night. The smell of charcoal and pine hit my lungs, replacing the stench of lies and cheap champagne. Marcus followed me, the heavy door swinging shut behind us. He didn't say anything. He just handed me the keys. "Where to?" he asked. "Away," I said. I looked back at the glowing windows of the restaurant. Inside, the Allen family was finally realizing that the bridge had been blown. They were on their own. I put the truck in gear and didn't look back. The mission was over. 48 hours. That was the window. Marcus had predicted it with the grim accuracy of a veteran scout. "When they thought you were broke, they deserted you in 24, he said, staring at the cold rain lashing against our kitchen window. "But now that they know about the 10 million, give them 2 days. The hunger will override the shame." He was right down to the minute. On Monday morning, the silence of my house was shattered. My phone, sitting face down on the oak table, began to vibrate. A relentless, frantic buzzing that sounded like a trapped hornet. Notifications flooded the screen like incoming mortar fire. Jocelyn sent 6 paragraphs. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic revisionism. She was so sorry for the misunderstanding. She claimed she was just stressed about the move, and that her comments at the Rosewood Grill were meant to be a joke. Patty followed up with a voicemail, her voice a shaky, high-pitched warble that would have cost me $5,000 a year ago. She talked about family bonds and motherly love. I didn't listen to the whole thing. I didn't cry. I just sat there, my posture as rigid as a flagpole's, watching the screen light up and fade, light up and fade. They weren't sorry for the 20 years of bleeding me dry. They were mourning the death of their golden goose. They were panicking because the vault was locked and the code had been changed. I opened the family group chat, the one they'd used to coordinate their raids on my bank account, and typed one sentence. No capital letters, no exclamation points. "I need time. Cease all contact immediately." I hit send and then engaged the nuclear option. I blocked every number. I deactivated the social media accounts they tracked. I went dark. The military ATM was officially out of service and the screen went black. By Tuesday, the fallout of my no began to crater their lives in real time. The Millfield grapevine was loud, and Marcus heard it all at the hardware store. Without my signature as a co-signer, the bank hadn't just paused Jocelyn's loan for the Maple Ridge mansion. They had shredded it. The deal collapsed within hours. Jocelyn lost $40,000 in earnest money. That was cash she didn't have. Then the internal rot started. Todd, the silent accomplice, finally found his spine when the bank started asking questions about their debt-to-income ratio. He discovered Jocelyn had secretly opened 3 credit cards in his name, racking up $25,000 in lifestyle expenses she'd promised to pay off with my next bonus. Their suburban dream was being sold off for scrap. Even Patty wasn't safe from the aftershocks. The church ladies at Grace Community had seen the show at the Rosewood Grill. They had heard my mother call her decorated daughter a failure. In a town like this, hypocrisy is the only sin they don't forgive. For the first time in 4 decades, Patty walked into the Sunday service and found no one had saved her a seat in the front row. She sat in the back, near the drafty exit, shrouded in a silence she had built for herself. But the predator wasn't done. At 12:47 a.m. on Wednesday, an emergency bypass call broke through my phone's blockade. It was Patty. "Lexi, help, my chest. It hurts so bad I think I'm having a heart attack. Your father is dead to the world in his recliner. I can't breathe. Please." A year ago, I would have been in my truck before the text finished. I would have broken every speed limit in the county to get to her. My heart would have been in my throat. Now, I just sat up in bed. I didn't reach for my keys. I didn't even wake Marcus. I picked up my landline and dialed the county hospital emergency desk. My voice was as flat and clinical as a dial tone. "This is Lexi Allen," I told the dispatcher. "I'm checking on an intake for Patty Allen. Possible cardiac event. White female, 64. There was a pause. The sound of typing. I'm sorry, ma'am. We don't have anyone by that name in the ER or the waiting room. Check the ambulance logs, I said. Nothing for that address tonight, ma'am. I hung up. The coldness in my chest was a solid, immovable block of ice. She had used the ultimate lie. She had weaponized her own life to try and force me back into the harness. I picked up my cell phone and typed a single response to her text. I called the hospital. You aren't there. If you do go, tell the billing department to send the invoice directly to my attorney. I will pay the facility for legitimate medical expenses. I will never hand you cash again. Do not test me on this. She didn't reply. The heart attack apparently cured itself the moment the checkbook was taken off the table. The next morning, I sat in a high-back leather chair in a law office in downtown Chicago. The room smelled of expensive tobacco and old paper. Across from me sat a man in a $3,000 suit who specialized in one thing: protecting wealth from parasites. The irrevocable trust is finalized, CWO. Alan, he said, sliding a thick stack of papers toward me. The $10.5 million is now a fortress. Not even a court order from your parents could touch it. You are legally shielded. I picked up the heavy pen. My hand didn't shake. I signed my name for the last time on a document involving the Allen family. With that ink, I established a legal blockade, a total embargo. A certified letter was sent out that afternoon to the house in Millfield. It was a formal notification. No more roofs, no more tuition, no more bailouts. Any future communication regarding money would be handled by a legal firm, not me. I walked out of the office and stood on the sidewalk, the cold Chicago wind biting at my face. I looked at the crowds of people rushing by, all of them fighting their own battles. For 20 years, I'd been the supply line for a family that would have let me starve in a foxhole if it meant they could buy a better car. I took a deep breath. The air was sharp, but it was clean. The perimeter was set. The war was over. But in the back of my mind, I knew there was still one piece of the puzzle left in Millfield. One person who hadn't asked for a dime. I reached into my pocket and felt the small, crumpled envelope I'd found in my mailbox that morning. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was written in the messy, looping scrawl of a 14-year-old girl. The silence was finally broken, but this time, the voice was different. 6 months. The dust had finally settled in Millfield, leaving a trail of broken credit scores and silent dinner tables in its wake. I didn't look back. Cedar County was different. The air was thinner here, sharper, smelling of pine needles and the damp, heavy promise of a long Pennsylvania winter. I stepped out onto the gravel driveway of the ranch, the stones crunching under my scuffed work boots. It was 5 o'clock. The sun was still a bruised orange line on the horizon, struggling to break through the mist that clung to the 200 acres of ridge and valley I now called mine. I walked to the end of the drive, where the galvanized steel mailbox stood like a lone sentry. It was cold to the touch, covered in a thin skin of frost. I pulled the handle. Inside, there was the usual clutter. A flyer for a tractor supply store, a thick envelope from my legal team in Chicago, and a small cream-colored square that didn't fit the pattern. No return address. Just a Millfield postmark and a name written in the messy, looping scrawl of a teenager. Brianna. I didn't open it there. I walked back to the house, the silence of the woods pressing in. I climbed the porch steps and sat in the heavy wooden rocker, my back straight, my eyes scanning the tree line by habit. I took a slow pull of my coffee. It was black, hot enough to sting, and tasted like wood smoke. I tore the envelope open with a steady hand. There was no mention of the Maple Ridge mansion. No mention of the tuition money she'd lost or the cars Jocelyn had been forced to sell to cover her debts. It was a single page of lined notebook paper. Dear Aunt Lexi, the letter began. I saw what happened at the restaurant. I saw the papers you put on the table. I didn't understand everything back then, but I do now. I heard Mom and Grandma talking when they thought I was asleep. They weren't sad because you left. They were mad because they couldn't use you anymore. I wanted to tell you, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for being part of the weight they put on your back. You didn't do anything wrong, Lexi. You're the bravest soldier I know. I'm going to finish school on my own. I promise. I sat there for a long time, the paper crinkling in my grip. I looked out over the frost-covered fields, my breathing shallow. For 20 years, I had survived IEDs, supply shortages, and the grinding machinery of the U.S. Army. I had survived my mother's coldness and my sister's predatory greed. Through all of it, I hadn't shed a single tear. I had turned myself into a fortress of stone and scar tissue. But as I read those words, you didn't do anything wrong. The permanent knot between my shoulder blades finally unspooled. My left shoulder flared with a sharp, familiar heat, a phantom pain from an old shrapnel wound. But it was followed by a strange, light emptiness. A sob broke out of my chest, a dry, jagged sound that echoed off the porch ceiling. I leaned forward, my head in my hands, and let it go. 20 years of being a human ATM, 20 years of being labeled a disgrace for not having a degree, 20 years of being the only one who cared about the bloodline. It all poured out. The truth had finally been recognized by the only person in that family whose soul wasn't for sale. I wiped my eyes with the back of a calloused hand and stood up. I didn't go back inside to sleep. I went into the small office where the satellite phone sat. I dialed the direct line to my estate lawyer. Lexi. The lawyer's voice was groggy. It's barely dawn. I need a subtrust, I said. My voice was clear now, the grit back in my tone. $50,000, educational only. It is for Brianna Allen. I want it locked down tighter than a vault. Jocelyn can't touch it. Patty can't touch it. If any of them try to litigate, the whole thing dissolves and goes to a veterans charity. Brianna gets access when she hits 18, but only for tuition and books. Send the paperwork to her school counselor, not the house. Consider it done, he replied. Anything else? No. That's the last of the supply line. Cut the cord. I hung up. I wasn't being soft. I was planting a tree in a wasteland. I had severed the rot, but I wouldn't let the fire consume the only part of the Allen name worth saving. I was financing a breakout from the toxic cycle I'd barely escaped myself. An hour later, Marcus pulled up in his rusted-out truck, the engine a low, rhythmic growl in the quiet morning. He hopped out, carrying a box of blueprints for the new logistics consultancy we were building on the north end of the property. He stopped at the foot of the porch, looking at my face, then at the letter sitting on the table. Incoming mail? He asked, his eyes narrow. Intelligence report, I said, a small grim smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. The next generation is holding the line. Loretta Briggs pulled her Buick into the drive shortly after, her trunk full of saplings and a thermos of tea. She sat on the porch with us, watching the sun finally clear the ridge, turning the frost into a sea of diamonds. We didn't talk about Millfield. We didn't talk about the Allens. We talked about the soil, the winter prep, and the security of the perimeter. I took a final sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a raid. I wasn't waiting for a crisis. I was just there. I looked at the black phone sitting on the table. It was silent. No vibrations, no demands, no guilt. The security perimeter was set. I was finally off the clock.